Alright, good evening and welcome everyone. Tonight, author David Fitzgerald is going to be giving a lecture on the historical evidence surrounding the historical Jesus of Nazareth. This lecture is sponsored by the Secular Student Alliance and the Secular Student Alliance at California Lutheran University. The Secular Student Alliance at CLU is primarily a club on campus for non-religious students. However, what we focus on is exploring faith through both discussion and experience. Our group holds meetings every Sunday at 8 p.m. in the Student Union building, and we go on religious visits throughout the semester to explore different religions and the complexities that surround them. David Fitzgerald is a writer and historical researcher who has been actively investigating the historical Jesus question for over 10 years. He has a degree in history and was an associate member of CSER, the former committee for the scientific examination of religion. He lectures around the country at the universities and national secular events, and is best known for his popular multimedia presentation, The 10,000 Christs and the Evaporating Jesus. He has also been called one of the biggest atheist activists in the Bay Area, in addition to serving on the board of San Francisco Atheist Center for Inquiry and the Garrison Martin Project. He is also the director and co-founder of both the world's first atheist film festival and Evolution Palooza, San Francisco's annual Darwin Day celebration. He lives in San Francisco with writer, producer, and movie actress David Fitzgerald. I welcome your comments, questions, and criticisms throughout the event. I'm sure David will bring those up at the end. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the author of Nailed, David Fitzgerald.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me come. This is actually the first time I've ever given this talk or talked on this subject at a Christian university. So, you know, I'm sitting here in the front row thinking, okay, where am I going to get in trouble and then the talk? And then I'm thinking, well, yeah, look at page 1 there. So, I just want to start out by saying I didn't really write this book for Christian audiences per se, because I'm not trying to really convince anybody that there is no Jesus if you already are on a first-name basis with Jesus. Mostly, I'm trying to write this book. I wrote this book to talk to atheists who just assume for sure that there's good evidence for Jesus, and and that's what started this. So why would anybody say that Jesus never existed? I mean, after all, even if you're an atheist, surely there had to have been a guy who started Christianity. Well, 11 years ago, 10 years ago, it never even entered my mind that there might not be somebody named Jesus of Nazareth, or a bunch of guys like Jesus of Nazareth, or someone very close to him that got the whole enchilada started. But here's a better question. Why today, 10 years down the road, aren't more historians on board with the thought that there is no Jesus? This is the thing that's come up most from atheists now, and that's why I've added this to our talk. Tonight's talk actually is going to be very free-form. Normally it's a lot more structured, and what I'm going to do is just sort of give you a quick and dirty intro to the subject, and then we'll open it up for Q&A afterwards, and that's probably where we'll get into the meat of stuff. But until then, I want to ask you to consider this. If you're a historian, only a small percentage of you are going to be biblical historians. The rest are going to be historians in every other possible field of history you can. So if someone asks you a biblical historian question, you're going to say, if you're an ethical historian for the most part, well, that's not really my field, but biblical historians say this, blah, 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 blah. Well, who are these biblical historians who say things about Jesus and assure us that there was at least a guy named Jesus? Well, if we look at them, traditionally, and over time, and even today, overwhelmingly, biblical historians, the field has been dominated by religious figures, either Protestant, Catholic, clergy, overwhelmingly Christian, with some Jews and Mormons and such to round it out. But for the most part, it still remains the one field of science that's still dominated by a theological bent. And I make that point in the book, and people have accused me of making an ad hominem attack by saying that. And I really don't mean it to be, but I mean, think about it. If you are a Christian, how open are you going to be to the idea that there was no Jesus at all? If you already are on a first-name basis with Jesus, I believe, at least when I was a Christian, that was just a no-go, non-starter from the get-go. And so we constantly hear from historians that, oh, that's a total given. There was absolutely a guy named Jesus. And the idea that he was a myth, well, that's just crazy nonsense that came up in the 18th century. And we constantly hear that the mythicist case is this crazy Victorian holdover that was rebutted a long time ago. So when did that happen? As Robert Price points out, the arguments of the mythicist camp have never been refuted. They've only been steadfastly ignored. In fact, they've been harumphed by the men who say harumph. But that's Christian biblical scholars for the most part, and religious scholars, or ones who came out of a religious background even if they're not traditionally religious. What about the secular biblical scholars? Well, they actually have come up with several different Jesuses, and even this chart here is just a small amount of the more plausible ones. At the bottom of the screen you'll see that there's even crazier crackpot Jesuses that are out there. Well, how do these stack up to a real Jesus? And why are there so many of them? You'll often hear critics of the mythicist camp say, oh, well, that's about the Jesus of faith. We're talking about the historical Jesus, as if there was only one of those guys. But as you can see, we've already got at least 16 on that page. And how plausible are any of those scholarly reconstructions? Well, as far as it goes, they all have their strengths. None of them are particularly far-fetched. They all tend to focus on particular constellations of gospel elements and interpret them in a certain way and reject the others as inauthentic, just like all historical hypotheses. They all have a solid historical analogy they can fall back on for their new take, but they all suffer from two fatal flaws. As Bart Ehrman points out, most, if not all of them, don't make sense of Jesus' death. Why would the Romans crucify this guy? Why wasn't he just stoned to death by the Jews, for instance? But to be honest, the Gospels themselves don't make sense of Jesus' death either for the same reason. And as Robert Price points out, this very multiplicity of convincing possibilities is exactly the problem that we have. All these various reconstructions of Jesus sound great until you hear the next one. They cancel each other out. As he says, Jesus simply wears too many hats in the Gospels. Exorcist, healer, king, prophet, sage, rabbi, demigod, and so on. He's a composite figure. The historical Jesus, if there was one, might well have been a messianic king, or a progressive Pharisee, or a Galilean shaman, or a magus, or a Hellenistic sage, but he could not very well have been all of them at the same time. So where does this leave us and Jesus? Well, I wrote a book about it, and if you give me a count of 3, there it is, there it shows up. What I'd like to do tonight is walk you through this book, these 10 beautiful lies about Jesus, these 10 Christian myths that I wrote because I wanted to point out that the idea of mythicism, whether you accept it or not, it's not a crazy idea, it's not a crackpot idea. And there's a lot of crazy crackpot ideas floating around about Jesus. And so my argument tonight is just to show you that this is not one of them, and this is why. So let's just get going with myth number 1. And that, of course, is the idea that Jesus was a myth is ridiculous. And this, as I said, we've already talked about, this is what you constantly hear from Christian theologians, from biblical historians, that, oh, this has all been rebutted years ago. Douglas Gavett, a Christian apologist, has said that the evidence for the resurrection, for instance, passes the muster as one of the best attested events in history. Now, Richard Carrier heard that and said, oh, is that true? Well, let's look at the evidence for that. For instance, Julius Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon and Jesus' resurrection. Well, to begin with, we have Caesar's own account of the crossing of the Rubicon. But with Jesus' case, we have nothing written by Jesus, and we really have no idea who wrote the Gospels. Second, many of Caesar's enemies also reported the crossing of the Rubicon. But we have no hostile or even neutral reports outside Christianity of the resurrection until well over 100 years after the supposed event. There's numerous inscriptions, coins, mentions of battles, conscriptions, judgments, on other lines of evidence that form an almost continual chain of physical evidence for Caesar's entire march. And yet, in the case of Jesus, there's no physical evidence of any kind for Jesus. And in fact, what we have is the opposite. We have a history of known frauds, of Shroud of Turin, the bone box of St. James, that go back into Middle Ages. Fourth, almost every historian of the period reports the Rubicon crossing, including the most reliable ones and the most prominent of the Roman era. But not a single historian mentions the resurrection until the 3rd and 4th centuries, and then it's only Christian historians who have done this. Finally, the Roman Civil War simply could not have proceeded as it did if Caesar had not physically crossed the Rubicon, taken his army into Italy, and actually really, truly captured Rome. And yet the only thing necessary to explain the rise of Christianity is the spreading of the belief that the resurrection happened. So when we look at all the evidence for both the Rubicon and the resurrection, as the event would have us do, first of all, we see that in 5 out of 5, we have good evidence for the Rubicon, and in 4 out of 5, we have no evidence whatsoever for Jesus. And the one fact that we do have evidence for is not the best evidence, but the worst kind of evidence. A handful of unknown, anonymous, biased people who are inside the cult and not neutral at all. So let's move on to myth number 2. Jesus was wildly famous, but there was no reason for contemporary historians to notice him. It never fails to crack me up that biblical historians will treat Jesus as if it's the linchpin of human history, and then when you start asking them for evidence about him, they start immediately backpedaling and saying, oh, well, you know, it wasn't known during his own time, and blah, 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 even though the Gospels have him being bigger than the Beatles for his entire ministry. And in fact, there's all kinds of huge things happening in the Gospels that should have made attention. For instance, we've got Caesar taxing the world. Now, this causes all kinds of problems, not least of all because Matthew says it happened during the reign of King Herod, and Luke says it happened during the reign of Quirinius when he was governor of Syria. Now, Herod died in 4 BC. Quirinius didn't become governor until 6 AD, so that's a gap of 7 years. And there's lots more reasons that make it a problem. For instance, Galilee, Nazareth, where Jesus was, where Mary and Joseph had to come from to get the tax, wasn't part of the Roman Empire during the time that Jesus was born. And there's still other reasons it doesn't work. But Herod's slaughter of the innocent. Herod had lots of enemies during his reign, and they loved telling up and calculating in great detail about what he'd done and how much they didn't like it. And in fact, they think one of the inspirations for this very event may have been when he killed his own 2 sons. That may have what sparked this. Even though the mytheme of a young child that has escaped from the evil ruler, that's a very common myth in world mythology. Jesus' triumphant entrance to Jerusalem. To read the Gospels, they specifically, explicitly say that the entire town came out and welcomed Jesus as their new king. Now, the Romans, I think, would have taken a dim view to this, being that they were in charge of Jerusalem at the same time. And of course, there was Jesus casting out the money changers. One of the interesting things about this little event is that 3 of the Gospels say this happened at the very, very end of his career, his 1-year career, and that's why the Jews, that was the spark that made them lead up to his execution in that week. Not John. John has his 3-year ministry kick off with Jesus going into the temple and kicking out the money changers. And again, this event, which would have happened, some people say that, the traditional picture is Jesus coming in and knocking all these guys out by himself, which is slightly ridiculous because the temple area was huge. It was surrounded by armed guards to protect the guys from doing things just like this. So some historians have said, well, what really must have happened is that he led a small army of zealots. And that's how he managed to clean up the temple without being this one-man kung fu army of death. But that just makes the problem worse because, well, if he brought an army in, then somebody really should have noticed that then. And then we've got all the events that happened surrounding Jesus' death. We've got supernatural darkness that covered the whole region. If you read Luke, it says covered all the land, implying the world, if not the entire region of the Middle Eastern area. We've got 2 earthquakes that were strong enough to break stones. And perhaps my favorite in Matthew, we have all of the graves opening up for all the holy men of Jerusalem who came out of their graves and appeared to many in the streets of Jerusalem wandering around. And then, of course, finally we've got his resurrection and ascension in front of lots of witnesses. So here's the thing. Who saw this happen? Well, if we look for eyewitnesses, and we're assured by Christians that there are tons of eyewitnesses, even lots of atheists say, oh yeah, there was plenty of eyewitnesses, historical record for Jesus. Well, let's check about this. All right, first, where's Jesus on the timeline? Here's the first century. We've got him from -4 BC, which when Herod died, to 33 EE, which is the latest date that he could have died. Jesus could have died, rather. Now, these points are very sharp on here, but I have to tell you that both his birth year, and his death date and death year are guessing games. We really have no idea when he's meant to have been born and meant to have died. And as I said, Matthew and Luke give us two completely incompatible dates, the earliest being 4 BC. His death becomes a guessing game from the clues in the Gospel. They know it has to be on a time when a Passover fell on a Friday, and when it was during Pontius Pilate's reign, and so we've calculated that it had to be either the year 31 or the year 33, if the first three Gospels are right. If John's Gospel is right, it couldn't possibly be either of those, because he has Jesus being killed on a completely different day than the other Gospels. But let's leave that aside for a second and just assume that he's somewhere in there, probably. So where are the witnesses that talk about Jesus? Well, when we put them on the map, the very earliest one we have is Flavius Josephus, writing in a book that was written in 93 or 94 AD. And everybody else lines up with him in the 2nd century and 3rd century and beyond and beyond and beyond. And that's not to say that there weren't plenty of people in time around in that same period of Jesus' time that were in a place that they could have noticed. Yet these names are never on any apologist list because they don't have anything to say about Jesus. I go into greater detail in the book about some of these. In particular, Pliny the Elder, Seneca, Gallio. Gallio actually appears in the New Testament himself. He is the judge who was the magistrate at Paul's trial. Justus of Tiberias and Nicholas of Damascus, they weren't just important people in the court of Judea and historians in that time, but they actually were primary sources for Flavius Josephus as well. And we also have Philo of Alexandria, who was a Jewish historian and philosopher, who wasn't just intimately connected with Jerusalem during this time. He may have actually been in Jerusalem at the time all these things had happened. And even though he writes volumes and volumes about religions of the time and about sects in Judea, and has ideas that formed Christianity, like the idea of the Holy Spirit, like the idea of the Logos, as in the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, he has nothing to say about Jesus or Christianity. So here's one quick point to ponder, because I also hear this from atheists. Could Jesus have been a stealth Messiah? It's like, yeah, sure, okay, maybe everything in the Gospels was exaggerated. I mean, we know he didn't do those miracles. We know he didn't really raise from the dead. Maybe he just wasn't that big deal, a big deal at all. And when the Gospels say that his fame spread over, Syria, Decapolis, Greece and Rome, that's just more exaggeration that came later. Well, here's the thing. We actually have a lot of information from the 1st century. It's not a case of this being some big black hole of history where we just don't know that much about what happened in the 1st century. We actually know quite a lot about the 1st century, and we know a lot about all these lesser loser messiahs in the time who really didn't do anything exciting at all, except for the most part say something crazy, whip up a crowd or two, a small following, and then get themselves killed. And some of these names are a little more famous, like John the Baptist and Simon Magus and Apollos of Tyana. But all these guys, who by any standard you match them, were lesser figures than Jesus. They made the history record. Jesus didn't. And there's another interesting thing to point out about that. In the Gospels and in Paul's letter, we're repeatedly warned about people preaching other Christs and preaching other Gospels. And these are so different from Paul that he curses them as agents of Satan. And the disciples go to Jesus and say, oh, we saw this guy who's casting out demons in your name, but he's not one of us. We see this throughout the Gospels.